This is the Cameron Journal Podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. It's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal Podcast. Welcome to season 3 of the Cameron Journal Podcast. Longtime readers will know that every summer I do a special series of episodes, usually while I'm taking a break from everything else, to delve into some special topics. And last year, season 2 was a bunch of hot and heavy topics about banking and westward expansion and all this type of thing. This year, much lighter. But with no less serious, because this affects anyone who does not leave their house naked. The series this summer is going to be on all things fashion, and unlike me droning on for 45 minutes on my own, I have brought a special guest. My dear longtime friend Bradi MacSleyne is going to be joining us to talk about all things fashion. This is a topic that her and I can drone on about for a long, long time, so we're gonna have to keep it short. And it's going to be a very exciting series. We're going to talk about fashion from soup to nuts, from the very beginning of like fabric and weaving all the way through to style and a little bit of history and some fun stories along the way. So today's, if you notice the title, today's topic is the history of fabric and weaving. So I'm going to bring Bradi in and we're going to get started. So hello.
Hello.
Hi. So this is going to be an exciting topic because everything starts from here. So so everything starts from fabric and weaving. You did more research on this than I did. So why don't you start and tell us what you learned along the way?
Well, fabric and weaving didn't start that way. We started with leather, with animal products being used to make clothing, to make coverings, to make blankets, to do all of that kind of stuff. And then throughout history, we eventually developed weaving, which actually originally came from basket weaving. And once we learned basket weaving and how to do that out of, breeds and grasses and things like that, we learned that we could take some of these grasses and things and even some of the animal products and weave them together in order to make something that's more pliable, more comfortable, and more usable than something as stiff as like leather can be, especially back in the day.
Well, and also weight as well. Like animal skins are super heavy, so
yeah.
That's
why you got more of the weaving came into more of the warmer parts of the world earlier than the ones in the colder parts of the world, because in the colder parts of the world it made more sense to have the weight of all of the leather and fur and all of that stuff, whereas in the warmer areas it made more sense to try and find something lighter and less dense.
Yeah, no, I mean, like in Alaska, the Inuit and native tribes would like kill a seal, have lunch, and then also make some new clothes.
Yep,
So
exactly. Yep.
I saw an episode on Bear Grylls. He killed a seal to eat, skinned it, and turned the top part of its body into a waistcoat. Like you shimmied it. Yeah. So I imagine 40,000 years ago. That's I'm gonna go hunt me
about what it was.
Yeah, I'm gonna go hunt me a new vest. Is what's good.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I thought was really important that I kind of didn't think about till I thought about it, and then we're gonna get into antiquity, is like like there was a time where we had clothing and coverings before sewing. Sewing was an innovation, like
Hmm.
later
Hmm.
on. And those early needles were all made of bone. Some of them have survived, because bone.
Bone or porcupine was a big one that they used to use a lot for needles.
Yeah, anything kind of sharp and pointy
Hmm.
that could go through the fibers,
Yeah.
that had been
And
put
then once
together.
they, like, at least for a lot of indigenous tribes and things like that, once they started using needles for creating these garments, that was when you started to get a lot more into the elaborate decorations of the garments. Adding beading, adding fringy things and that kind of stuff instead of just a basic draping situation.
Right. Yeah. Well, and also I think the other kind of big innovation, and this is also true with animal skins, was getting the right type of rocks that were sharp enough to cut things. So like you could
Mhm.
make a leather thread to make a pants or things like that. But you had to have the right, it was really a tools development sort of thing, you know.
Yes, very much so. Because
Yes.
before that, it was a lot of just kind of wrap yourself in something.
Right. Yes. And I think, and as we kind of talk about weaving and all this type of thing, it's important for people to remember, because we're going to talk about it again and again and again. There were no synthetic fibers before the 20th century.
Yep.
Everything came from an animal. So there's an animal
Mhm.
husbandry aspect to this as well. I noted that we had cotton, although that wasn't really a thing till the 18th century. Wool was extremely common. Alpaca in the Americas, natural silk derived from worms in Asia, and other tree and plant fibers, including some new ones that we've developed, like using bamboo and this type of thing. That's fairly a recent phenomena, but all of those things were, I mean, and that was it. And same thing for dyes. There was a very
Mhm.
limited set of like earth jewel tones. That's all
Yeah.
you could
There
dye
were certain
fabric.
colors you just
Yeah.
couldn't get. Like, that wasn't it's a color you could see in Earth in the world, but not a color you could dye anything.
Yeah. Well, and a
And
lot
that
of the
is
dyes, yeah.
adding to that is also that is part of the reason for some of the domestication of animals like sheep, alpaca, those kinds of even goats. But
Yeah.
that's a lot of the reason why they ended up domesticated is because not only were they good for food and some for milk, but also good for, shaving them and making things.
Well, and in the case of things like, goat and sheep and all this type of thing, you had dual purpose. You could use the fiber, and then when the animal got old, you could use the skin. So in that
Hmm.
way, you were using it, animals also fed you. So it's like it's feeding you, it's clothing you. So the appeal of animal husbandry was that you could, raise an animal and then use it multiple different ways.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're going to get into, and that same thing with synthetic dyes didn't come around to the 20th century, but we'll get into that as time goes on. So I have here in the notes, prehistoric textiles are very rare because fabrics don't survive. And that is
Yes.
110% true. Leather goods don't even really survive after so long.
They do
um,
survive longer than a lot of the like weaving things. So we have some of that, but a lot of that is from mummification and things like that. Um,
yes.
to give us an idea of what people were wearing and what they were doing with themselves at that point. Um, but yeah, most of it doesn't survive unless
No.
it's synthetic, and then it survives a long time.
Yeah, well, because it's plastic.
Hmm. Yep,
We'll get into that when we get to the
exactly.
20th century. Yes. So, it says here specimens of dyed fabrics had been found in Roman ruins of the second century BC. I also noted that there was a biblical reference to fabric and fabric dyeing. One of the characters in the
Yes.
New Testament was Lydia, the dyer of purple. Brady and I both grew up religious, so we know about this already, but we're sharing for the listener.
Mhm.
Um, and she was known for dyeing purple fabrics and was an early supporter of the apostles and Jesus Christ during the Apostolian period. If you want to go read her story, it's in Acts. Don't ask us how we know that, but it's there.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, that was. But I think the important thing about that, especially particularly in antiquity, was the fact that there were sumptuary laws. Certain dyes were reserved for certain people. This very
Yes.
vest in ancient China, illegal. In most of Europe, purple was reserved for nobility and royalty. That was
Yep.
that was it. So
Mhm.
And the other thing in antiquity is a lot of clothes were woven as one piece. So
Yes.
yeah, it's like a Roman toga is it's actually U-shaped. Most people, that's why you when you take a square sheet, you can never get the shape right because the natural toga is actually it was U-shaped, but it was a solid woven piece. It was one piece that was then tied. Same thing with the Great Chiton. And so there, that was a very, very different from what would happen even a few centuries like after the fall of Rome. So
Yeah.
yes.
And also, I mean, that also even is continued today in like saris and a lot of bridal and stuff like that of different cultures that use the wrap look to make the outfits.
Yes. Well, no, and that was also a matter of time and expense. Sewing, a large garment or even multiple garments by hand it's very tedious. It's a lot.
Mhm.
The manpower or really woman power that was needed to make that happen was a lot, which made it very expensive. Whereas weaving it as one piece already in the shape that you needed it
And
was still a lot of work, but it was less work than
the
sewing.
weaving part was going to have to happen either way. So you're
Right.
paying for one half of what's going to need to happen for the full garment.
Yes. Yes. And that's you see that we don't really do that anymore, but you see that in things like the Shroud of Turin, which was supposedly the cloth that Jesus was buried in the tomb. That's one single woven piece. Togas were that way, chitons were that way. There were lots of things that it was a single kind of woven piece that was, just there and you wrapped it and went from there. And that was yeah, that was and that's how things remained as we move forward through history a little bit. um that things kind of remained that way until we get to about the Renaissance when pants come into fashion for men. um
Mhm.
Less so for women. The Middle Ages, we have a note here. Certain Turkish tribes were skilled in the manufacture of carpets, felted clothes, towels, and rugs. Obviously, the Near East, that side of the Mediterranean, was always well known for its textile goods.
Yes.
Yes, and that also Silk Road stuff that was kind of one of the reasons why is they were the interface between Europe and Asia. They were at the crossroads.
Mhm.
So you had all these wonderful, and small kingdoms that whose names I don't remember anymore and who have been mostly lost to the sands of time. That there were whole civilizations that was their primary, source of income and trade, and it was textiles and the things to make textiles. you know
Yeah.
Textiles have been a big
Textiles and
business for
spices were the
centuries.
big thing.
Yes. And that being at the crossroads geographically speaking, um was perfect for that. So if you were a tribe in a kingdom between Turkey, which was then called Asia Minor, all the way over to what is now Iraq and Jordan. And there was a lot of kingdoms and civilizations in there, even as far east as Iran, what's now Iran. That was just perfect geography to be at the center of all the trade going across east and west, which enabled a lot of really beautiful things to be made and happen and traded and bought and sold, and eventually those things made it to Europe.
Hmm. And eventually Europe realized they really liked their fabrics. So they started
Yes.
going there to get it more often.
Well, and the other, yes, and also climate. We're talking getting back to natural fibers. You have a climate thing as well. Silkworms require a subtropical climate that Europe
Hmm.
does not have. So until literally very recently, natural silk had to come from China or some other comparable
Yeah.
climate in that band of geography.
Hmm.
Otherwise, the silkworms wouldn't survive, and no silk for you.
Yeah.
So, fun fact. The Japanese empress is required by law and tradition to keep her own silkworms.
Yes. That is
And
true.
yeah, and they have this wonderful little shop. The Japanese are so like, it's tradition, but we're gonna do this as little as possible. They have a little shop in the Imperial Palace with her the silkworms, and then the little things she does to get them out of it, because it's the husk you need that has the silk. And with the little husks, and she's doing the silk and all this type of thing. And there's a great video on YouTube of her doing the silkworm thing. Just like the emperor is required to plant his own rice. So like every spring he goes out and plants like 10 plants of rice, and that's it. Sort of thing. They have the little area. It's like, yes, we're doing the thing. Only 10 plants. But like,
They're
yes, we're doing
extracurricular processes. It's fine.
Yes. Yes, before Akihito and his wife abdicated and retired for their younger children, they used to do the rice and the silkworms. They also completely off topic, but they also drove an like aging 1995 Honda Accord. So there's a great
I kind of love
video.
that.
Yeah, there's a great video of them just like tooling around town in their Honda. It's kind of adorable. So just this nice older Japanese couple driving around in their Honda. So it's, I mean, and obviously that car doesn't have a lot of miles, and of course is incredibly well maintained.
Incredibly well maintained, I'm sure.
Yes. So that's a lot of fun as well. So, but going to the Renaissance, getting back on the subject of fabric and weaving,
Okay.
but also understanding this is a mass cultural thing. We're going to go around the world through this whole process. In the Renaissance, we start seeing manufacturing and of the starting of the beginning of mass production of fabric.
Yes.
And
Actually employing large amounts of weavers to all weave instead of just everybody doing it their own.
right. And that the thrust of that was because of two things: Protestant Reformation and the rising of the trading middle class. So, like we mentioned a moment ago, the trading between Asia and Europe, the people who did that, starting with like Marco Polo in the 14th century and moving forward, that actually really changed things economically and politically in Europe, because all of a sudden you had a new class of people that were not noble, they weren't aristocratic, they weren't royalty, they also weren't peasants, and hence the middle class. They were between, and so they usually weren't landed, but they had a lot of money from trading, because of course they sold everything to the aristocracy, who gobbled all this stuff up. And so you had this, so that gave them the capital, which is how we got the seeds of capitalism. Different podcast, go listen to season 1. Or go read my book, different podcast, we're not going to go there right now. But like that gave them the capital to start these factories to mass manufacture these things.
Yeah.
And they were still doing it by hand.
They were still doing it by hand.
Yeah, we wouldn't get machines for another 300 years.
Yeah.
No, that's
But we were getting to the place where even though we were weaving by hand, but we were weaving on such great scales that we also were developing seamstresses that were sewing garments together at that point.
Yes.
Even just very simple, basic ones.
Well, yes, and also especially in European fashion, the decoration, like if you look at the Middle Ages, you don't have a lot of decoration even among the wealthy, the aristocracy. By the time you get to the Renaissance, when you look at like Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, the decoration has gone completely overboard.
Yeah. They were starved for it. They just had to have so much at that point.
Yeah, it was a little nuts. For sure. It was getting a little crazy. I don't know why anyone thought that, what I need? I need a collar out to here, that I can walk in.
Can't move my head. And then, time develops and we're like, hey, we should put those on dogs so that they don't chew on their wounds later on, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So the next time your dog's in a cone, thank Elizabeth I.
Right.
So we have that in the Renaissance and kind of the beginning of capitalism there. Then in our pre-modern period, which is the 17th and 18th century, we then have the beginnings of sort of factory and piecework that was often farmed out to women at home, which
Mhm.
I thought was interesting. I kind of sort of maybe remembered that from high school. But I'd kind of forgotten that there was that for a poor woman, it was a way doing piecework, sewing and whatnot was a way to make extra money to supplement the household
Yeah.
income.
Yeah, because you could do that while watching the kids, staying at home, doing all the other things that needed to be done,
Right.
but it paid decently. And if you could get good work at it, gave you a little bit more clout too, because you were desirable.
Yes. And it was also, and I think there was also a certain decentralized aspect to it as well that I think um standing in contrast to our next period, the industrialization, where we put it all into factories.
Mhm.
It was kind of this decentralized sort of thing. And I thought that was rather kind of interesting as well. But I mean, also incredibly sort of feminist. And that's why when we talk about, women's involvement in the fashion industry, it's important to remember that it was, even though men kind of gotten all the press for fashion, everything
Mhm.
we've talked about so far was primarily done and spearheaded by women at home. Like the
Yes.
men were nowhere to be found. Like it's not the emperor that keeps the silkworms in Japan. It's the empress and her little
Yep.
silkworms. Like it's
Hmm. Yes.
yeah,
Well, and it's one of those things that even after, even once we got to the industrialization of fashion, you still in any like more rural areas and things like that, every community had a sewing lady, a seamstress that would not only make but also fix everything. I mean, flour sack dresses and everything, even up into, you know, the Great Depression, there were still always women that were making clothes.
yeah. No, and that's why I said it's kind of funny that men get all the press
Yeah.
for fashion and design,
Being
all
the
this
big
type of thing.
designers.
Right, but the reality is when people talk about women in fashion, it's like when have women not been in fashion? They've been doing it
Yeah.
since antiquity. Like this shouldn't be a far stretch. Um, but it's
But once all
still
of the big designers came out and were men, then women were viewed as just either model or salesperson
or
or
consumer.
client.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, or yeah, consumer.
And you didn't have, we weren't talking about, because there weren't very many women big designers, or not as many.
Yeah. Which I mean, like I said, considering women have been so much the thrust behind fashion and fabric and weaving and sewing and all the stuff that we've been talking about, it's kind of funny that in the modern industrial context, we had to revert to the meat. We had to get women back involved and well known in the industry that they had essentially invented and been doing for millennia.
Hmm. I mean, Coco Chanel literally dressed masculine and acted masculine to try and fit in with the old boys club of the designers at the time. Like,
Yeah. No,
because they just
yeah.
weren't, women weren't really accepted at that point.
No, I think the sad thing about, that aspect of it is that there's no, and gets into us to the industrial period. I'm not quite sure how out of all of that, other than it was the men who owned the factories and the machines, um, how women kind of got cut out of the equation when it came to
Well, women
controlling fashion and all this sort of thing.
women weren't allowed to own things, weren't allowed to have property, no less factories. Um,
And the
and
machines and
so
all this sort of thing. Yeah.
the machines and all that stuff. So they just didn't have, and it became unfashionable to work on things like that unless you were a peasant, I mean, unless you were the lower class. Upper
Yeah.
class, the people, the men that were doing the design houses and stuff like that were part of upper class, and upper class women were expected to not do that because that would be undelicate and putting yourself
Associating
out.
with the poor. Yes. And
Yes.
yes. And so, and when we get into the industrial period, which is really the biggest Industrialization was the kind of the biggest thing to hit fashion since the needle, really, since sewing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so textiles and people kind of this doesn't really get taught anymore. Textiles were the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So the flying shuttle, invented in
Hmm.
1733, sped up weaving because you were able to get the weft across the woof faster. I think I have those terms right. I always get them mixed up. And then we had and then also in terms of colonization and working in the new world, um the colonization, especially by the British, was really kicked off by the fact that the climate in the American South was suitable for mass production of cotton, which was the world's first cash crop. So,
Yeah.
and also indigo to use as a natural dye. So when we have these conversations about like, well, why did the Europeans ever get in a boat and go to America? Well, they were looking for India. That's a whole separate story. Um, but really, what kept it and cemented it was natural fiber for clothing. Textile strikes again.
Yep. Yep. And dyes that they hadn't seen before.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, especially especially for things in shades of red. That was
Red was a big one.
Europe
Yeah.
doesn't have the plants and whatnot to create shades of red very well, so it was so rare. And
Hmm.
the New World did. The New World also gave us
Yep.
some things like the tomato and the potato and all this sort of thing. But
Oh, yeah.
um everything from the nightshade family. Europe
Yes.
is too cold for all those. And so that also was there. But all then with the first colonists in North America, fur trade. We're going to talk more about
Yeah.
that later in the series.
Yep.
That you had the first furriers and and that was and of course by this time you have scissors, you have sewing, so they could take small amounts of fur from small animals and line a cuff, a collar. All it wasn't
Hmm.
just huge coats and all this type of thing. And that was, I mean, people forget that was what financed the new European colonization of the New World. Gold has gotten all the press, but it was really cotton and fur. That's what
Yes.
really got.
Very much so.
Yeah, without those things,
And
Europeans would never stayed in North America. Most likely, that
and there were animals here that had different types of fur, and so it was even more exotic and extravagant if you got beavers from the
marmot.
US, a marmot,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
because
marmot, beaver, all these things
it's
were
still
in
yeah.
Europe. Yes, yeah, and so then it was exotic and new and exciting and
Mhm.
yeah, it's that. But that's so in to some degree. I think one of the things that I've learned not only in this topic with the history of fabric and weaving and all this type of thing, but in the series as a whole, is how much I think the portmanteau of textiles in world history. A lot of stuff happens in the name of cloth.
Yeah, and it doesn't get a lot of credit for how many things happen simply because we want to clothe ourselves
Yeah,
and like the way we look.
yeah. And especially when we get into being fashion and fashionable and style, I'm sure we'll return to this topic. But I mean, yeah. I mean, you had the whole, and that was I mean, and with cotton especially, you had cultivation of cotton in the New World. That then gets us the transatlantic slave trade, which is how
Mhm.
half of me got here. And then we also have, even the start of the American Civil War. It was also a competition between Northern factory owners wanting cotton at a certain price, the British willing to pay more, and you have this whole economic struggle over cotton because they were now able to make fabric at an industrial scale very quickly,
Yeah.
far cheaper. And so I mean, again, it's kind of like and that's why I get frustrated when people talk about it's like, oh, it's just clothing, or oh, it's just something you wear. It's like, no, this stuff moves world history. Like
Yeah.
clothes is the reason whole countries exist because of clothing.
There have been wars started purely based on clothing. Like
Yes.
it, it's very, and I mean, honestly, as much as the Industrial Revolution had to do with a lot of other things, what primarily drove the Industrial Revolution was clothing and fabric.
No, absolutely. Textiles was the first big thing that got industrialized. Again, with that flying shuttle from John Kay. Then you also had what made cotton production easier, cotton gin,
Mm-hmm.
made it to clean
And
it faster. And so then you were able to produce, huge bales of cotton at far less cost. You could make more fabric. And all that's this also democratizes fashion for the common person, which was
yes, yep.
huge.
Mm-hmm.
Because most people until 200 years ago, if they owned two outfits their whole lives,
They
that
were
was,
probably doing quite well.
yeah. I mean, it was, there was, and people patched stuff until it fell apart, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and when fabric was so expensive, you didn't dare throw the stuff away. Everything was saved, and old dress from 40 years ago, put it in the attic and hang on to it. We'll use it for something later
Mm-hmm.
on, yeah.
Or, you have kids growing up and be like, okay, so there's six of them. We buy one outfit and then we pass that on and then we buy one more outfit for the first one and then we pass that on and then we just keep doing it that way because that's why the bottom kid always got the crappiest clothes because it just got passed on. We didn't They didn't have multiple outfits.
No. And I was thinking about, modern industrialization of textiles was all of a sudden you had this great democratization of fashion in terms of
Mm,
you could and it all but the only reason that happened was because you were able to get cheap fiber out of cotton. Thank you, cotton gin. Cheap fabric out of weaving. Thank you, flying shuttle. And then the other innovation that I also wanted to mention, sewing machine.
the sewing machine.
The
Ah, yes.
sewing machine absolutely 110% changed the game because then you could sew
Changed it.
fabric at 10 times the rate, you know.
Hmm. And because so quickly the sewing machine became such an efficient machine, it also became more available to even those that were less wealthy to like you save up, just like we used to save up for a computer, you'd save up for a sewing machine, and then mom could make all the clothes. Or
Yeah.
you could do a side gig of doing some of the manufacturing.
Yeah. Or take in sewing and mending from neighbors,
Hmm.
so it was
Yep.
something that so I mean so again, thanks to the sewing machine, we see kind of this regression to women using sewing and clothing and textiles as another way to supplement the household income.
Yep.
um and especially before electricity, sewing machines were manual run, so it was a big
Hmm.
foot thing on the bottom, and you moved your
Yep.
foot
You
up
have
and
to
down,
put all
and
the
that
way.
spun the machine to sew. Yeah, yeah,
Yep.
and that was a huge innovation, and it really allowed mass manufacturing of clothing. What I think is interesting is if you look at how things were in the 19th century and now, barring the advent of electric sewing machines, when it comes to clothing manufacturing, not a lot has changed. People
That
don't
is
know
true.
this. I mean, not a lot has changed. Clothing is one of the areas where automation has not really touched,
No.
which I think is interesting.
I mean, I think the biggest thing I can think of that, other than, the things we've talked about, that has actually changed in the last 100 years is having automated saws to cut out multiple pieces of fabric at one time.
Yeah,
But
automatic scissors
yeah,
is definitely, yeah,
I can't think of, I mean, I've watched one before where he was cutting through like 12 inches of fabric, which is really
yeah,
super cool, but it was still the guy with the saw
right,
and pattern
yeah.
pieces that then got sent into a workroom of mostly women sitting with sewing machines
Yes, no, and
manufacturing.
that's the thing I think is so fascinating is in all of these conversations, like when we talk about this stuff, I mean, the technology for these things, most of the technology we now take for granted in textiles and clothing has only been around for 300 years.
Hmm.
This has changed very slowly. And even with all of the new automation and AI and all this type of thing, your job is secure. AI is not
Yes.
coming for you anytime soon.
AI cannot take over what I do.
That's
Definitely.
yeah, that's if it's like, are you looking for a tech-proof career? Try being a seamstress or a
Being a
tailor.
seamstress.
Not going
Mhm.
anywhere anytime soon.
Not going anywhere anytime soon.
Yes.
Somebody's gonna need you at some point.
Yes. Although I will say those new automatic embroidery machines are pretty cool.
I know those are pretty cool. They kind of scare me. I haven't tried one yet, but they're cool.
Yeah. But that's what it on that front. Now that we're up to the 20th century, we can have a fun talk about synthetic fibers and synthetic dyes, because those all come along in the early 20th century as a product of petrochemicals. And
Yep.
all of a sudden, you can produce any color you want out of a lab. No more gathering flowers, gathering plants, and steeping them like a tea until the color is concentrated. No, none of that. No more of that. We now
Hmm.
can just make whatever color we want. Like if you're watching the YouTube version, behind Brady, she has a quadrillion colors of thread in a bunch of different shades. Um, exactly. And then on top of that, you have synthetic fibers. So now
Hmm.
you're getting your dyes from a lab, you're getting your fibers from a lab, and this is the that synthetic fibers has literally been the only real major innovation in fibers for fabric since we discovered we could not just wear animal skins.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. And also the synthetic fibers, and not only the synthetic dyes, but then having synthetic setting agents for even natural dyes. So that they stay, so you don't steep all this stuff, dye all your stuff, and then you just don't wash it because things come out if it's not really in there good.
Yes. No, absolutely. And that also, in the 18th century, the first synthetic dye was for mauve, which is a light
Hmm.
purple, and that was quite revolutionary at the time because making purple was expensive, so it was only reserved for the wealthy, and then all of a sudden practically anyone could have it.
Yeah.
And that also allowed really the middle trading classes to take, advantage of that and participate in that. And also the end of sumptuary laws helped with that as well.
Yes.
No more fashion laws. Um, and then the other kind of thing within that, with synthetic fibers is with things like nylon, rayon, Dacron, Gore-Tex, and even the bulletproof fabric I'm not thinking of right now, that starts with a K. It'll come to me in a second. Um, with Gore-Tex, you have the ability to have waterproof clothing. That didn't exist before synthetic fibers, by the way.
Nope.
The best you could do is soak stuff in certain oils derived from animal fats, and it would kind of be okay. That was
Mostly,
the
usually, when you were doing that, you do that with leather because that was the strongest one if you were
Yeah, I was about
using
to say, and
the
even then you're
mesh.
gonna want
But
leather because yeah,
then you just walk around smelling like a rotten animal after that. So it
yeah.
wasn't the most ideal.
The past did not smell great.
No.
And then yes, and then you also have Kevlar is the word I'm looking for. Kevlar, bulletproof fabric.
Hmm.
That didn't exist until about 60 years ago. Um, Even with when it came to stockings had been made of cotton or silk for centuries, and then you have the advent of nylon, and it
Nylon.
completely changed. I mean, which is kind of funny because now I think the only person who wears nylons is Her Royal Highness Catherine, Princess of Wales. She still has to wear nylons.
So, some judges still require it from female lawyers as well, which is archaic in my opinion.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it was like the last person I knew that wore stockings when I was in any capacity was my mother for church, and my mother hasn't been to church since about 2008. So,
Yep.
yeah,
Yep.
that was about it. I mean, which is kind of funny because if you told someone in 1945 that nylons, which a woman wouldn't hardly leave the house without nylons on, you said, oh yeah, in 70 years, no one's going to wear these anymore, they would have thought you were
Mhm.
nuts.
Well, I mean,
Um,
in World War II, when we had the nylon shortage and we didn't have enough silk or nylon to make stockings, women were even paying to have seam lines drawn up the back of their legs and their legs tanned slightly in order to appear that they could afford to buy nylons or stockings.
yeah,
They,
yeah.
so they didn't look bare-legged. Heaven
Mhm.
forbid.
Yeah, I know. It was when I worked in the state senate, the ladies still had to wear nylons, and there was a Walgreens on the 16th Street Mall that, it was I was on my way to work and got to run, had to stop in for and grab a
Yeah.
new pair for the day. That was always fun, and glad that I wasn't in that boat. I just had to wear the, heavy suit and the tie and blah blah blah.
Yeah. Mhm.
But I didn't have to
Even
deal
in
with
100-degree
nylons.
weather.
Yes,
Yes.
yes. Did not have to deal with nylons though, which was good. So that, yes, I mean that, but it's kind of funny how that's kind of fallen us off. But I mean, big innovation at the time because you were able to go beyond just cotton and silk.
Yep.
Um, and also, and another thing also was, there was another thing that got democratized, where people could have these things, multiple pairs of them, no less,
Mhm.
which 100 years before would have been only for the wealthy, and able to have that fashion, that style, literally from you know even farm women would at least have one pair for Sunday or something, which
Yes.
again was revolutionary, um,
Yeah.
and
Well, and that
incredibly
was
modern.
another thing that really kind of brought things forward at that time was like with nylons, the development of more automated systems to uh, knit fabric versus just weaving fabric, because knit fabric stretches, knit fabric moves, and we finally got to the point where we learned how we could automate that instead of just everybody sitting around with their crochet needles and their knitting needles and trying to make fabric that way.
Well, and also, speaking of knits, if you love a yoga pant or an athleisure, then you need to
Mhm.
think rayon every single day. That stretchy stuff would not be possible without synthetic fibers.
Nope, not at all. Not
Yeah,
at all.
yeah, even things like modern elastic, which is
Mhm.
a fairly recent invention, was made possible by synthetic fibers.
Yeah.
Back in the
Mhm.
day, they just tied stuff. You just tied, and like stockings were
Yep.
tied at the knee, and everything was just kind of tied on. But with
Mhm.
elastic, you were able to, have it be able to stretch to have it on, and then shrink back down to grab onto you.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and that was a big a big innovation. I mean, again, a lot of the stuff it seems so normal now, and we take it for granted. But if you went back 200 years and showed half this stuff to anybody at the time, they would have been gobsmacked because it didn't
Yes.
exist.
No.
Absolutely didn't exist.
Yeah. I mean, even just yeah, being able to put on your yoga pants and a t-shirt to go out, and it wicks sweat and it's comfortable and it's soft. Those are
Yeah.
not things that existed
Yeah.
even 50 years ago. Those didn't exist in the way they do now. Not in
Yeah.
comfort level.
Well, and it was funny because I was talking. One of the other things we noted was, like, in the 21st century, blended fabrics now are so common. I mean,
Yeah.
everything is a blend of fabrics now. Um, and I think the only people who have to avoid that are Orthodox Jews, because they can't wear multiple
Yep.
fabrics. It's like, I mean, everything now is. I mean, even a lot of like a good wool suit, they will have mixed, unless you really go for the 100% like wool from like the Highlands of Scotland, they will still mix
Mhm.
in something else into the fiber profile to have it stretch a little bit, move a little bit, fit a little bit better, all have a different finish texture, all
Mhm.
of those things, and that's
A little
all
bit
made.
different sheen to it, that kind of thing.
Yes, and that's all made possible by petrochemicals and synthetic fibers,
Yes.
which is just crazy.
Are we going to talk about the negatives about synthetic fibers?
Sure, absolutely. And there are many.
I mean, my biggest negative for synthetic fibers is that they they just sit in landfills forever. They don't ever go away. I mean, they
They're
will.
basically plastic. I mean, that's the thing, they're
It's
basically
basically plastic.
plastic. Really
Yes.
fancy
I mean,
plastic.
I have dresses from the 60s and the 50s that are vibrantly, beautifully still all the same colors that I've washed a million times that I still wear because they don't fade, they don't degrade, they don't fall apart, which is great. But they also don't do that when you put it back into the earth. They don't become earth again.
Right. Yeah. No, and that I mean that is I mean, and also I think the other I think downside with synthetic fibers, and this is where fashion, when it comes to industrial, waste and everything, fashion is kind of the world's biggest criminal next to transportation, is the waste. So like even in a natural fiber, you take the fiber and you're carding it, and then you form a yarn, usually with a spindle, either drop spindle or a spinning wheel, and then you take that yarn, you go over to the loom, and then you weave and make fabric. um there's, even in that process, you have waste. Then when you go to cut out the pieces to make the clothing, a lot of those small pieces can't really be used for anything anymore, and so that becomes waste as well. So in an industrial setting, you have tons of fabric, we have no way to recycle it or use it again or a different way, and it just gets thrown out. So when you talk synthetic fibers, you have the extraction process of the oil, the chemical process of making it in labs and all this type of thing. You have the output, and then you have more waste in the making of it. So when you look at fashion from end to end, there's so much
So much
waste
waste.
in creating clothing. That
Well,
it's
and even like with my job, because I'm mostly alter wedding dresses and I'm small scale, it's just me altering wedding dresses. The amount of trash that comes out of my sewing room that is just fabric because every little bit you snip off. There's nothing you can do with this piece like this.
right.
So, and it still is a lot of waste. And that's not even touching what how much waste these wedding dresses took to make in the first place.
Yeah. Absolutely. And like I said, and especially like with something like bridal where you have very exotic fabrics, which can be,
Hmm.
a mix of natural synthetic fibers of many different kinds to
Yes.
create some of the crazy fabrics that they use in bridal. I mean, you have all of this, kind of waste and exploitation. My other problem, besides the waste problem in fashion, is synthetic fibers, if you don't mix them with something, are stiff and hot.
Oh,
They don't breathe to save their lives.
I went through the punk rock phase in high school where I used to buy old polyester shirts from the 70s from the thrift store. Believe me, they are not comfortable. They are
No.
so uncomfortable and they do not breathe. And you're if it's cold, you're freezing. If it's hot, you're dying of heat. There's nothing, they're not helpful.
Yes. Yeah.
You've got
And
to have
people,
something natural in there.
yes. And people from the past who were used to cotton and alpaca and wool and all this type of thing would have been horrified at
Yes.
why on earth we would ever use synthetic fibers for
This is
fabric.
not functional.
Yes. Yeah, no, and it's kind of funny because you have, these fast fashion retailers like Shein who, do all polyester stuff and all this type of thing very inexpensively, very exploitative, with lots of waste, all the things that we mentioned. And then they send you this. I've got some of the stuff. It is stiff as a board. It
Mhm.
needs You
Yeah.
need something else blended with it. Synthetic fibers on their own are not great.
Not great. No.
Yeah, yeah.
But they do amazing things when you mix them with the right things because then you can have something comfortable, breathable, and stretchy all at the same time. But it has to be mixed. You can't
Yes.
just do
I mean, I think the only
pure synthetic.
example, yeah, I think the only use case where I think all synthetic is really great is in something like Gore-Tex for waterproofing. If you want a
Well,
really
yeah.
good raincoat, then you want the outer shell to be 110% plastic.
Yes. And you don't
Yes.
really care how stiff it is at that point because you just want to be dry.
Exactly. Like, or even like fabric in car seats, things like that. That
Yes.
situation where bring on the synthetic fibers. But like if it's touching your skin on your body, you're gonna want something else in there.
Yes, for sure. You don't want Gore-Tex underwear. You just don't.
No, nobody wants that. That
No,
would
nobody
be
wants that.
that would be terrible. I think it's kind of interesting, like how I think, and this is I think why nylon was so popular because it stretches and all this type of thing. Is not that women again wear it much anymore, but nylon's not horrible to wear. It doesn't breathe, but it actually
No.
feels nice.
Yeah.
And it's like especially like as a dude, like even though women don't really wear them anymore, like still nothing sexier than a pair of stockings, and that feels great. Like ladies of the world, like if you want to get a man's attention in a hurry, put on a pair of thigh highs and rub up against his leg. You will have our attention immediately. Whatever we're doing doesn't matter. There's a stocking where I'm like, how can we help you? Like that. We will
That's true.
immediately have our attention.
But
So
nylon, the development of nylon was what led to the development of like Gore-Tex. Like it's all just the
absolutely.
step-by-step process of learning how we can make this stuff more solid and more protective.
Yes. Absolutely. I think one of the things I miss from a lot of modern fabric is we don't have the local variants of design anymore the way we used to. Like you used to be able to, in centuries gone by, you could tell where a fabric was from based upon the design pattern and how the colors were used and all this type of
Mhm.
thing. And unfortunately, in our globalized environment, we just don't have that anymore. We're all using the
No,
same stuff.
yeah. And everybody has access to everything. So there's nothing, I mean, I have done some, like, I had a client one time who had me work on some traditional Polynesian outfits that were woven there and sent the fabric and all of that stuff. And like those things can be very specific, but overall, you can just go online and buy whatever.
Yeah. No, I mean you can, as happened to me one time, you can go all the way to Africa and still see someone wearing an I Love New York t-shirt. Oh.
Yep, it's true.
Well, it's coming up to the top of the hour, so I think we've covered fabric and weaving rather well.
All right.
So we're gonna bring episode 1 to a conclusion. And then next time in episode 2, give you a little preview, we're going to do fashion and function, or the story of how clothes affect our lives, which will be rather interesting because a lot of people don't regard fashion as anything that affects most people in any way unless you're one of those people, like we are those
Mhm.
people. And that is that's not quite the case. That's not quite the case. So that's next time, number 2 in the series. So stick around and listen to more fashion talk from us next time.
All right. Bye bye.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter. And we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.